New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, Mind, Body, Spirit University, a leader in fully accredited in-person and online U.S. college degree programs in the topics we cover here. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we are going to explore the question of whether we are the aliens, the non-human intelligences. My guest is Bruce Olav Solheim, who is a distinguished professor of history at Citrus College in Glendora, California, where he has taught for 26 years. He's a specialist in the Vietnam War and also teaches a course on paranormal personal history. Since the age of 4, he has experienced angels, demons, cryptids, telepathy, psychokinesis, mediumship, and alien contact. He recounts these experiences in his books, including Timeless, Timeless Deja Vu, Timeless Trinity, and Anzar the Progenitor. His latest book is We Are the Aliens, a case of alien-human integration. Bruce, incidentally, has been interviewed 4 times previously on the New Thinking Aloud channel. He has also written several academic books as well as 10 plays, 6 of which have been produced. He lives in Southern California, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Bruce. It's a pleasure to be with you once again.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey. I'm glad to be back, and it's really good to see you.
It's been a while, and I've had the pleasure of reading the Snark comic books that you've sent me. I know you have a real sense of humor about the many varied experiences that you've had.
It's very important. I love comic books, and even my theatrical plays that are very heavy topics, there's always humor. I mean, you have to sprinkle it in there.
Well, sprinkle is an interesting word because in your latest book, it is a sprinkle. It covers your dreams. It covers the possibility of you being under some sort of psychic attack or surveillance. It covers your conversations with Anzar, the alien with whom you've been in contact with now for many years. It goes into your childhood. It discusses geopolitics. And I think most importantly, from my perspective, and I think from yours, based on the title of your book, it deals with what I might call the non-dual reality of a oneness, which has been highlighted in mystical traditions around the world.
Yeah. In other words, we are the one.
So that's a very important realization, I think, because especially in the alien and UFO arena, people often get caught up into, I would call it, realms of duality.
And it's really been something that has evolved, of course, since I decided to start talking publicly about my experiences. And, coming from a hidden viewpoint where it was just happening to me and I didn't want to share it, to openly sharing it and then getting into the in between the ufology folks and the paranormal folks and seeing how sometimes they don't necessarily play nice together. And it's been quite a ride, I have to say. And but through all of it, I just feel like it's all really the same thing. If you look at David Bohm and this idea of the explicit reality, the implicate reality, the super implicate. It's really just the same thing. And all my experiences, whether they're so-called alien, or I don't really like to use that term, but or spirit, it's all seems to be doing the same stuff, popping in and out and communicating in a very similar way. And so it just brings me back to that idea that it's the holistic idea that it's one, it's all one, and that our reality is, we catch glimpses, of that. I guess physicists would call it the quantum world, where I think all this exists. And it's just fascinating. I learn something every day, and it's kind of funny. I don't know if I shared it. I think it happened after we spoke last, but I was just overwhelmed by all this. But then I thought, wow, I'm really starting to get it. So I went outside to look at the stars before I went to bed, like I usually do. And I was looking, and I said, I really think I'm starting to understand. And then the whisper in my ear, oh, you have no idea. So, brought down to size real quick. It's okay. Don't get a big head, just keep going. Keep asking questions, keep open-minded, stay open-minded, and talk to as many folks as possible, and stay true. That's it.
Let's talk for a minute about the course that you're offering now at Citrus College on personal paranormal history. The idea, I gather, is that the students will begin to do basically what you've done, is exploring the hidden recesses of their own memories.
Yeah, it's, I started it in 2018. Well, first of all, I was so surprised that the college even authorized it, because the board of trustees had to approve it. And they don't strike me as people given to, fantasy or any kind of, foolishness or whatever, anything woo-woo, I guess would be the term. But they were all on board right away. I mean, there wasn't any delay after I requested. And then I offered the course from 2018 to 2020 until the pandemic struck and we all went online. And I kept having a lot of the same students take the class over and over. But when it went to online, they just weren't interested. They wanted to be there in person, because the personal idea was the crux of the whole thing. And they wanted a safe space to talk about their experiences, whether they're UFO or abduction or ghosts or whatever. And I just, they wanted to do it in person. So it's coming back in person starting October 1st. And I'm really looking forward to it. And, we do a little bit, we have guest speakers, as you know, and we're going to do some, real easy experiments. And the big part of it is their sharing. And I learned that the first day. I had a lesson plan. Jeffrey, I had this lesson plan prepared, the whole evening prepared for my first class, and I had 35 students. And I learned really quickly that what they wanted to do was tell me and tell everybody else what has happened to them.
There aren't that many safe spaces where people can talk about these things without being afraid of being ridiculed.
That's the whole idea of that. That's why I called it the paranormal personal history. And what's kind of cool about that is it's also how I teach American history. I use, comic books. I use my own personal experiences. That's how I've always taught my history courses. So it seems to fit really nicely together. And I don't think there are too many credit classes offered. I know the university that's here in California that you're affiliated with, I think.
California Institute for Human Science.
I know they offer credit classes that are accredited and transferable. So I'll have to. I know I've looked at their website, and I've even sent an email off to say how excited I am about what they're doing.
I'm very excited about what's happening there, and I'm submitting some course proposals today, as a matter of fact, to them. Their catalog will be due out at the end of September, and hopefully we'll have some interesting new courses in their catalog then. But with regard to your work, you were telling me that these experiences, whether it's out-of-body experience or a near-death experience or mediumship or contact with aliens, there's something that unites, or perhaps a better word is links all of them together.
Well, the way that it happens is very similar. That's why I believe that the spirit world, what we usually call the spirit world, classical ghosts and mediumship and all that, and my alien contact or non-human intelligence contact, it all seems to happen the same way. And when I do my spirit walks, for instance, when I do it's about a weekly thing I do. I go out in a meditative state, but it's not like I'm wandering around in traffic or something. I do know what's going on, but I am recording with my little phone what I see, what I hear, what I feel, and the questions I ask, and I come back and transcribe it. But the process where I make the connection, I can talk to people who have passed on, like my friend Gene, who was the inspiration for me even telling my stories back in 2016 when he came to me in a vision. I can talk to him. I can talk sometimes my parents and other folks that I know that have passed on from this world. And I can talk to Anzar, who is a different character altogether. I've called him an ancient alien mystic because I kind of thought that's what he was. But that understanding has evolved as I've communicated more and done this more. And I now see that, as he says, an aspect of him is an aspect of me. So I kind of see it as I'm connected to him. And it wasn't just me that thought that. It was a Native American shaman that I know, a shamanistic practitioner, as she calls herself, who's the only other person who's seen Anzar and has communicated with him. And she was the one who talked about integration. So that's where that term integration comes in the title of the book, Alien-Human Integration. And she warned me about the process. She said, okay, if you're going to make this communication easier and you're going to do this integration or merging, as she called it, you have to be very careful. And of course, I was very careful about it. But the bottom line is the connection is the same, whether it's with Gene or with Anzar. And when I have visions of people who've passed on, like if I'm in a relaxed state just at home and I have a vision of them and I communicate with them, the same thing can happen with NHIs or what we call aliens, those experiences too. So it's all the same realm as far as I can see. It's all the quantum realm or the objective reality as opposed to our interface, the subjective reality.
Let's talk a little more about Anzar in particular. There are a number of things that were revealed in your most recent book. If I recall correctly, one of them was that Anzar told you that he first visited the Earth, if I remember correctly, was it 500,000 or was it 500 million? I forget which years ago.
500,000, I think it was. Yeah. 4 or 500,000. Yeah. Something like that. Yeah.
And he's been making occasional visits since then.
Yeah. That is, that has also evolved and at first I was wondering, why doesn't he just reveal everything right away? And then I thought, well, it's kind of like what the late Jim Marrs used to call metering. That he said that's the way the government works with, in this, we're talking about government, not revelation, but disclosure, you meter, so as not to cause too much commotion. So I kind of feel that he's told me that it's a little bit like that so I can understand enough. But yeah, the idea was that that's why he called himself at first the progenitor. And it was later I found out it was Anzar the Progenitor. So the idea of being the one who starts. And so I don't know if it was just him or the group of them, but what we would classically call aliens, what he prefers to be called star family, because he says we're all related to the one creator who made us all. And so it was about 400,000 or 500,000 years ago, and there was some what we would now probably call CRISPR technology, but much more advanced, that caused us to be the way we are. To go from early, pre-human to what we are today. So that's my understanding, and I'm not a biologist or a scientist, but that's basically the information I've gotten from him. So. But the interesting thing is that in that quantum realm, he's not just in the past; he's also in the future, and the present at any given time. Which is what my friend Gene said when I first talked to him after he passed away. Here's another connection point. Gene, who had been in this reality like we are right now, after a month after he died, came to me and in a vision and said, "Where I am, there is no past, there's no future. It's all just happening all at the same time. It's not the way you think of time. And that's when he also told me that. He made the joke. I said what most people would say, I guess, if you encounter somebody that had just passed away, what's it like to be dead? And he laughed and said, well, if I was really dead, the way you're describing it, would we be speaking to one another like this? And I had to laugh. And he was an actor, and he was very funny. And so he has a very humorous way, very direct way, oftentimes, of communicating with me. So, but anyway, that's my understanding of this connection and how far back it goes.
The other thing is, I recall in one of your conversations with Anzar, he tells you that you were at one time his grandfather.
Yeah, the idea is that he is, like I said, both simultaneously in the past and in the future, and the timeline is fluid, like the way I've heard it described, the quantum world, is so those connections that we have, the standard linear connections that we have in this interface, in this reality, don't necessarily apply. And that's, how it actually works, I don't know, but that's the best way I can explain it, or how I've understood it.
Well, the mystics are very clear. They say we are one with everything.
So that would be the easiest way to say it, rather than, yeah.
I take that literally. I take it very seriously. We are one with absolutely everything, which means many of the things that we detest.
Exactly. Yeah. It's interesting how, I think of historically, I think of Americans like Will Rogers, who often said, I've never met a man I didn't like, and people thought, well, that's hyperbole or whatever. But, I used to, and as you've had experience in prisons, you do run in. I've worked in prisons as a guard, and I ran into some very nasty characters in there for terrible things, but I always tried to find some kind of spark of humanity in them, because at one point they were babies, they were children, they were innocents, and then something went terribly wrong, and then they decided on a path, but yeah, I think that's the best way to understand it. And if we try to, think in a way that, I think they're called materialist scientists, who don't want to look beyond what has already been figured out and are not open to it. And not just scientists, but just regular people who just aren't open to a new way of thinking, which is why Anzar says that we are going through and have to go through a leap of consciousness rather than a leap of faith. And what's really interesting, he adds the part, and into a new era of reconversion, which I've asked for him to explain. And the best way that he's explained it to me is to understand what ancient people knew, and the way they were connected, like you said, to everything, the soil, the plants, the animals, the cosmos, the star people, as they usually call them. And that they're all connected, and we're connected to it. And that we have to understand that and understand our modern technology and merge the two as we take this evolutionary leap. And that's what he's been explaining to me. And as much as I can understand, that is what it is. I'm just so grateful for the connection I have, not only to Anzar, but all the experiences I've had. And I wanted to share with you the last month or so that I've been doing spirit walks. I've noticed something a little different. And I think I'm evolving in my ability to connect. And what I've noticed is that I can feel myself when I'm in the meditative spirit walk, that I am leaving my body. I'm walking, and I have the sensation of walking, but I'm also above my body, and I'm kind of like a puppet master or something. I'm kind of like manipulating my body to move, and I'm actually sensing it and kind of seeing it. And I think what that is just I'm starting. I understand better the process of meditation and the process of the focused relaxation. Even though I'm walking. And I think that's going to help. And that's part of this leap of consciousness, I think, is that, and I think, ancient mystics and people that are experienced meditators, of course, that's the experience they have, even though some say they kind of, I don't want to emphasize the kind of the high strangeness, they just want to focus on the path or whatever. But I think it's just part of it and understanding how that works. And I'm so grateful for that because it really helps me keep a clearer connection when I'm talking to Anzar or Jean or trying to understand the world around me and all this input. And, so that's just a recent step that I've made, and it's still baby steps. It's like I was trying to explain before, that it's like playing the guitar. You get to a plateau and you can do the chords and you can play most songs, but getting all the lead parts and all that stuff, that's another little cliff there that you got to scale. And I think this is, I got over another little cliff, but now, it's a false summit because it's still so much more to go. It's like when I was, climbing in the mountains, the false summit syndrome, and, but that was the latest thing is that I've felt that before, but on a more like a limited thing. Every once in a while, I'll feel like I'm above my body and, like a near death experience. You hear that explained a lot. And, but this is in a more controlled, I'm managing it. I never use the word control because I feel that's too strong of a word. I can manage my connections and this, the high strangeness a little bit better than I could before. And, I feel like this is a skill that I'm just now, getting better at and sensing it, not just kind of I'm doing it, but sensing that I'm doing it. And anyways, I just wanted to share that with you. It's a recent thing that I've noticed.
Thank you for that. In your professional life, you are a historian, and one of your specialties is American foreign policy. And I know you've had many conversations with Anzar about geopolitical events. And there's this idea that comes across in your book that there are the good aliens and the bad aliens, and that the bad aliens are influencing certain world leaders who are starting wars and creating chaos. And I wonder how that fits into this idea of non-duality and oneness for you.
Yeah, it's the best way I can describe it as is there maybe good and bad. If I did say that, it wasn't the right way. The best way to say it is how to deal with our evolutionary process, how these NHI aliens, the star family, how they're helping us. And I think they both want to help, but in different ways. It's kind of like a parenting strategy. Those parents that are overly strict and restrictive, and you can never do things on your own. So the control model versus the free will model. And Anzar seems to be of the mind, or at least expressing it to me, that he's more of the free will. And he feels there are those who are dealing with humanity, and specific leaders, geopolitical leaders, that favor the control model. And but neither one of those factions is going to allow there, at least what I've been told, for there to be complete destruction. So, like, example would be somebody like what's his name? He was at Malmstrom Air Force Base. He was a missile control officer. Bob Salas tells his story of how a UFO was sighted and then their missiles went offline. So I think they have the ability to do that, so as to show us that, they're not going to allow this, this massive retaliation to take place. But those that favor free will allow us to have war, will allow us to have strife and, negative things happen. And through that, we're supposed to learn, and which is it's a tough love, I guess, in a way, because I've had people ask me, why don't you just ask Anzar if he really is who he says he is? Why can't he just make poverty go away, make hunger go away, and make war go away? And from my understanding, the reason is because then there wouldn't be free will. And, so that's, I think there is still the oneness, but it's it's maybe different paths to get to the same goal, Yeah. And it's been explained different ways. I had a friend, a professor who retired a couple of years ago, who I reached him in a vision because a mutual friend of ours asked me to. And by the way, when I do mediumship, I never ask for money. I just, I don't blame people who do. I mean, if they do it full time and that's their living. But for me, it's just, I do it to help people. And that's the whole goal of this whole thing. And he reminded me, and I think Anzar has told me too, and I think one or two others in the spirit world, that there are many paths to the same truth, and I see that truth as being the one.
It seems to me the ultimate question, if everything emerges from the one, if the one is the source of all, then we have to, why is there a creation? Why are we here? Why are you in your body and I'm in my body, and yet we're one? Yeah.
It's a fascinating, it's a deep, probing, existential question, and that's the question I ask my students at the beginning of every semester, even though I'm teaching U.S. history, which seems like it would be mundane, but I ask them, who are you and why are you here? And that is a discovery that all of us need to make if we're going to take this, just in regular life, but also to find your vocation or whatever. But in here, we're talking about at a higher level in this evolutionary leap, discovering who you are. And then ultimately, I guess you find out that there is no other, that it is, that we think we are the other, but I think, and I read this again the other day, and I wanted to share it with you. And I'm sure you're familiar with it, many of your listeners are. A quote from The Grapes of Wrath. I love John Steinbeck, and especially The Grapes of Wrath, because the U.S. foreign policy and American political economy are two of my favorite parts of U.S. history, but especially the Great Depression era. But the quote is, and it's Tom Joad speaking. He says, well, maybe a fella ain't got a soul of his own, but only a piece of a big soul, the one big soul that belongs to everybody. That's one of my favorite lines, and it's a kind of a little soliloquy he does there with his mom at the end of the movie, and towards the end of the book. And it's almost verbatim from the book into the movie, which is kind of nice. But yeah, that realization that, you think you're separate, and then as you evolve, as you learn, you learn that we're all connected. And I think that's what's missing with a lot of folks that are so lost, is they don't realize the connection that we have to everybody else. And my parents were a good example. They, I don't know how, my mom and dad each had only 6 years of formal education. They came here in 1948, having lived in Norway and lived under Nazi occupation and terrible times. My eldest brother died during the war because they didn't have any medicine. But I got into a conversation with my mom during the civil rights era. This was in the late 60s, so I was pretty young. And she said, you have to understand something, that as long as I remain quiet and don't say anything, people pretty much leave me alone. She had red hair and blue eyes and freckles and, but she says, as soon as I talk, then they know I'm a foreigner. And then some people are not going to be very nice to me. But until that point that she talks and has the heavy accent, which I grew up with, heavy accents, and I love accents in different ways people talk, they have no idea what my what my ethnicity or what my origin is. And she said, but always remember this, and she was talking about Martin Luther King. I think this was just after the assassination, because they were devastated, as were so many other people. And she said, but for Black people, you can't hide what your skin color is. And she said, that's a very important difference. And so I always remembered that. And as I, grew up and went into the Army and experienced being with African-American people, for the first time, really, I had 3 African-American students in my high school. And went into the Army in 1978, and 20%, at least 20%, were African American. And so that has always served me very well. My parents' understanding of who they were and how it connected to other people, and how they, were tolerant of other people and understood their, whatever they had, that would be different than somebody else's life experience, and to appreciate that and work together. And there was another thing with my dad. When I was stationed in Germany, we were in Berchtesgaden, which is a beautiful part of Bavaria. And we were waiting to go in somewhere. I don't know if it was a tour bus or whatever, but my dad kind of disappeared, and my mom and I were looking, where's Dad? And we looked around, and Dad was over there with a group of African-American soldiers, and he was talking to them, and he was telling them a story in a very animated way. My dad was a good joke teller and storyteller, and they were all laughing, and they were, what we used to call dapping, to kind of show my dad how to do it, with, and I just looked at my dad, and I thought, wow, that is so wonderful how, he is so tolerant and so accepting. And I know that in the late 70s, we had segregated barracks in the Army. It was terrible. I didn't have one, but it was self-segregated, which was really kind of interesting. But anyway, I'm not sure how I got off on that topic, but my experiences are my upbringing, I was very, very lucky to have such tolerant parents. And I try to pass that along to my students, because they seem to be very, very lost in many ways, and not really angry, but more lost and confused. And because they're bombarded with so much information, much of it so negative. And so I find myself trying to do a lot of repair and instill some optimism and empower them to be the best person they can be. So teaching for me in college is as much counseling as anything else, and I'm not a trained counselor, obviously. I'm a historian, but I found that to be very true. And I do share my paranormal experiences now with my students, and not a whole lot, but some, and some actually go find my books and read them, and I don't force them to or anything. But so I think that's part of what I'm doing is, even though I'm teaching history, I'm also exposing them to some of the ideas that I'm learning in this exploration that I'm doing with Anzar and my paranormal life that I've been leading since I was a kid.
Well, the topic of our conversation today is, are we the aliens? And the word alien has multiple meanings here. Alien, it can refer to a non-human intelligence from who knows where. It could refer to a person crossing the border into the United States from Mexico. It could refer, when I was in college, the term we heard often is alienation. And the idea was that workers are alienated from their work. It's a basic Marxist idea. Or students are alienated from their parents. That was very big back in the 1960s and 70s, where we were told never trust anyone over 30.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I remember. Yeah, so when I asked Anzar in one of my spirit walks, I asked him, so do I call you an alien? And I could tell he kind of paused and he said, who wants to be called an alien? He said, who wants to be called an alien? He said, you should look it up. And I didn't think about it. I mean, I know the term, we'd used it, as you said, in many different ways. But I looked it up, and most of the ways that it's used are rather negative. And it doesn't sound very good. It doesn't sound good really at all. And I was kind of surprised, and I said, okay, well, what do you prefer? And that's when he told me star family. And as soon as he said that, I thought, wait a second, I'm not an expert on the Aborigines, but I know that that's a similar term, star people, star family. I'm not an expert on Native American history, but I know enough to know that that's how they refer to what Western culture would call aliens. And I said, okay, well, that makes a lot of sense, because then we're all connected, And so the concept then is that, if we are the aliens, is that, comes back to the one, that we are all connected. And that's, and he said star family, not star people, as if it was some other group of people, but star family. We are all together, and we might look different or, be in different, space-time continuums or whatever, but we are all connected. And, so and it's kind of interesting when, government officials who have denied, that we have any alien craft or alien technology. I'm thinking, well, how are they defining that? How are they, because I've heard them also say NHI, non-human intelligence. I've also heard David Grush refer to biologics were discovered with these crash retrievals, but he doesn't specify what that is. So I'm wondering if there's some word games going on where they can avoid saying, oh, well, we didn't lie. They're not alien according to what, that we're all one. So it's really not alien. What if they're future humans? Can't call them alien, right? So maybe we have the stuff, but you haven't quite pinned us down on exactly the nomenclature here. So if you're using incorrect nomenclature, we can have plausible deniability. So I'm not a lawyer, but I started to think, wow, this is kind of getting into some legal fine points here on how you define these things. And they did actually, I heard some members of Congress talking about interdimensionals too, but they only mentioned it once. I think it was Anna Paulina Luna. I think she's from Florida. I think she's a Republican from Florida. Anyway, she was talking about interdimensionals, but she only mentioned it once, and I think she was just coming out of a skiff. So I wonder if she kind of slipped it by accident, And the whole idea of a skiff is kind of as soon as they said, David Grush in his testimony before Congress last year, I think it was in August or July, he said, well, I can't answer it here, but I can in a SCIF, or a special compartmentalized information facility. The problem with that, of course, is once you go into one of those, if you're a member of Congress, you're not allowed to talk about it. So then we don't find out what they know. And even stuff that they previously thought or said, they can no longer mention because now they've been briefed. And that's the way that overly classified process works, which is to our detriment if a person is hoping for disclosure. But the problem I have with disclosure, and I know I'm kind of going off, but I'll bring it back, is that it's other directed. Disclosure is other directed. I'm going to sit here and wait for somebody else to tell me what the truth is, rather than taking it upon ourselves through what Anzar calls revelation, and not necessarily in the biblical sense, but this idea that it's revealed from within. You understand from within how we're connected and what's going on. And that is the more important process. And that's part of the leap of consciousness, is this revelation, as opposed to sitting here and twiddling our thumbs waiting for the people in Washington, D.C. to reveal to us or to disclose to us what the truth is. And we could be waiting a very long time.
We've been waiting decades, but this process of revelation will be going on for thousands of years, in my opinion, because there's so much yet to be revealed. I am reminded of the psychedelic era in the 60s and 70s. Back in those days, I had the privilege of conducting interviews with Terence McKenna, who was a well-known spokesperson for that era, a very articulate man. And people would take LSD and or DMT in particular, or psilocybin, and believe that they were encountering alien beings in the psychedelic experience. And Terence would say, we are so alienated from our own consciousness that when it manifests for us, we think we're encountering an alien being.
It's interesting how, the meditative experience, when I go into my connection on purpose, as opposed to how I lived my life before, which was just to have these connection points, these paranormal experiences happen randomly and frequently. I've now learned to manage it. As I said, I don't say control. I'm not bold enough to say I have, control of all this, but I do manage it better. Those experiences, I think, are similar to, and I'll just share this with you, when I was living on a farm in Minnesota. I was waiting to go back into the Army, to go to flight school, actually. I'd already served a hitch in the Army, and I was in the reserves, and I was waiting to the flight school to start, helicopter flight school, which I did later on. But I was living on this farm, and my brother-in-law at the time said, "Here, try some of this." And I said, "What is that? I don't, And it was in a little pipe, and he said, "Oh, it's hash." And I said, "Well, I've never had that. I think in high school I had tried pot or whatever, and it was very old, very mild stuff." But he said, "Here, try this." And okay, I don't really want it. No, go ahead. So I did. And I felt immediately very, very strange. So I said, "What?" I looked at it and I said, "There's kind of some white stuff in there. What is that?" And he said, "Oh yeah, that's angel dust, PCP." And I said, what is that? Doesn't sound good." And he said, no, it's really powerful stuff. And immediately we were in a car and I had to get out. And I started walking. And as soon as I started walking, I had the experience like I was just explaining I've been having for the last month or so. I felt like I was a balloon above my body. That's what I felt like as I was walking in the house. Well, the terrible thing was I knew that something was wrong, and that was a terrible thing I had just taken part of. So I had to get downstairs in the basement where we were staying temporarily with my in-laws. And to get to the basement, I had to go through the living room where my in-laws were watching the Wheel of Fortune on TV, on one of those old big console color TVs. And it was a brightly colored room. And it took me, I'm not sure, I lost all track of what time was. So I was a balloon, so I was going through there like I'm carrying a balloon of myself. And I was waving to them. And I think it took me 15 minutes, when I think about it later, to walk across, a living room. And then when I got to this step, and they were just looking at me like I was the weirdest person in the world, which I guess I was at the time. And I didn't walk down the stairs. The balloon floated me down the stairs, and then I was on the bed, and I couldn't feel it, so I felt like I was floating above the bed. And so that was a chemically induced out of body experience. And that was the only one I've ever had, and that was the last time I ever. I was too afraid after that. No, I don't ever want to have that experience because I didn't have much control of it, as opposed to when I go on my walk and I feel like that I have management of it. I can, okay, now I'm done with my meditation. I'm not a balloon floating around without any, with the currents of the wind or whatever. So, but the idea is that, I think the best way to get there is, and I'm not saying that people who use pharmaceuticals or whatever, that's their own personal decision. But for me, the fact that I can get there naturally and make those connections without those drugs or pharmaceuticals, I think is very, very important to know that you can do that. And I think it was Dean Radin's book, Real Magic, where he mentions that all it really takes for real magic, what he calls real magic, is attention and intention. And he said the incantations, the candles, the drugs, the rituals, all that is, if that helps you to get to that attention and intention, then that's the purpose it serves, but you don't need it.
I would add a third element. I would say intention, attention, and patience.
Oh, yes, exactly. Lots and lots of patience. It's not going to happen overnight. Yeah, that's for sure. And like I said, there's a plateau. If you are working on these things, you will reach a plateau, and that can last for quite a while.
Well, Bruce, this has been a fascinating conversation. Your book touches on so many different elements, and I think it'd be worthwhile to share one of them with our viewers that you shared with me recently as a conversation you had with Anzar about the 2024 election.
Yes, I do. Well, because I'm a historian, and I was also, I started in graduate school in political science, but then I switched international relations, and I switched to history in my doctoral work. But even one of my doctoral fields was international relations. So, and my specialty is U.S. foreign policy. So, of course, I'm very interested in our elections. And Anzar shared with me before, and I was looking at some notes or the transcripts of all the communication I have with him, which is about 350 single-spaced pages of transcripts from the last 7 years or whatever of these spirit walks. That as early as 2021, he was telling me that there was an illness, that President Biden had an illness and it was affecting his cognitive abilities. And of course, people played that up for political purposes. And then it became clear that, that there is some difficulty there. But he said that he will not, that neither basically it comes down to this. He said neither President Biden nor former President Trump will become president in the next election. So he said that a while ago. And then, of course, President Biden dropped out, and the vice president, Kamala Harris, is now the candidate. But he said that so if Biden is out, that means Trump is the only one left, and he's, according to Anzar, that's not going to happen. And it's interesting because he always warns me about predictions because of the hidden variables. If you go into physics or whatever, or quantum theory, that Bell's theorem, this idea of hidden variables. He always warns me. He says predictions can be wrong, but preparation is never wrong. So, because you're not sure which timeline you might be on, but from what I've been told, in almost every timeline, neither President Biden nor former President Trump will be president. So I can pretty much assure that, as best I can, with Anzar's help, that the only person left, of course, would be Vice President Harris.
Or some surprise.
I don't know. I don't ask for, predictions of the future often. So oftentimes he just shares this information, but he always has that caveat. Predictions can be wrong. Preparations are never wrong. But he can help me with what I call assisted remote viewing, like what's going on right now, things that I can't possibly perceive on my own. So he does. I often will ask, those kind of questions, which are real time. Well, in our reality anyway. And that's much more accurate as far as I've seen.
You consult with Anzar about geopolitical events.
Yes. Yeah, because I'm very concerned, my main field being foreign policy, which is basically the study of wars, and I know that there's cycles in war. And like every American war always has an economic rationale, a ideological rationale, and a psychological rationale. And once those baselines are there, then events start happening. And then the key is the trigger event. There's an emotional trigger event. And it's always the same formula. Every American war has been the same. And from what I see, not only Anzar's, insights, but here at home, that the baseline is there, the events are lining up, and there could be a possible trigger event on the horizon. So that's what worries me. That constantly worries me. And based on my historical training, but also on the insights I get from Anzar. So I'm hoping for the best. And I have friends of mine who are psychics, and they say, well, don't think that something bad will happen because you'll make it happen. And I said, well, I'm not trying to manifest anything bad happening, but I want to be prepared. And I want to prepare others, so that in the event that it does happen, you won't be like totally shocked or surprised, And there really are cycles in history. So, and they're very, very helpful for understanding how this works, how history works, which is basically just forces of change and forces against change over time.
As I recall, and correct me if I'm wrong, Anzar seemed to be stating emphatically that war is in our future, a serious warfare.
Yeah, unfortunately. And that's, a similar thing happened before COVID. He told me that there was this major thing. He didn't mention COVID or anything. He didn't say that exactly, but he said preparations were in order, that it was going to be that millions of people would die, and that to be ready. And that was a year before, that was so in early 2019 when he warned me of that. So I was kind of ready. Ginger, my wife, was ready as best we could be, for the major disruption that was to happen. But millions of people did die, unfortunately. And when I was trying to tell people when it first came out that this was a very serious thing, I was attacked. and I'm not trying to, I wasn't taking a side. I just said, this looks very serious. I don't think it's just isolated, to a couple people or in China or whatever. This is going to be worldwide, and we should all be very aware of this. And I had people, attack me, and, not colleagues, but people I know at the college who said, you're just fear mongering, and I'm thinking, I'm just trying to be helpful. We got to take it seriously. And as we know, it became highly politicized, unfortunately, and which kind of caused people to lose sight of, taking practical precautions, and as we try to figure out the origins and all that. So this kind of knowledge is very helpful, but it also sets you up for people that just don't want to handle it. They don't want to hear it. And so when I say that we have to be prepared for internal turmoil or a major war, I'm not bringing it on by saying that. It's kind of like the old thing about suicide. Well, if you don't talk about it, then people won't do it. Well, nothing could be more wrong. You have to have people talk about it so they understand what it is and can prevent it. That's the whole idea. And maybe it can at least knowing that this terrible thing could happen, this larger war, that maybe we can make it lesser, than it would be ordinarily if we can just work together. And anyway, that's a long way of just saying I'm not going to keep my mouth shut. So I'm going to talk about it anyway.
Many people hope that the various world conflicts that are going on right now can be resolved peacefully. But the truth of the matter is that they could just as easily get worse.
I teach a Vietnam War class, and I teach a World War II class. And I so often find myself, going over the material and thinking, wow, there's some real similarities here with what's going on. And it's rather frightening because I understand these cycles in history. And I don't want to make young people, more nervous than they already are, because there are a lot of anxiety going on. But I think that knowledge is power, and if they feel like they can do something, at least ameliorate it, try to do something to prepare or help in some way or feel like they can be helpful. I think that's extremely important. But it really comes down to, I think, that famous quote by Lyndon Baines Johnson at the beginning of the escalation of the Vietnam War, where he said, and he wasn't a particularly articulate man, but he was an interesting historical character, but he did some great things, but the Vietnam War wasn't one of them. But he said that basically it comes down to war is killing a man you don't even know well enough to hate. And and that is really what it comes down to. And if people just, I often, when I talk to people, I say, isn't it interesting that long after the war is over, former combatants get together and they're like dear old friends, and they have this respect for one another. What if we could do that before? Skip to the end part where we're now friends, and not enemies. And I see that with Vietnam vets. They go to Vietnam, they meet people who were NVA or the North Vietnamese Army or Viet Cong, and they get together, and the people in the village find the elders who were in the war, and they get together with the older Americans who were there, and they break bread together, or they eat together, and they talk, through interpreters or whatever. But why can't we skip to that part and dispense with the killing? There's so many cases of that I know you've heard of. The Christmas truce, unofficial Christmas truce in World War I, where they were singing Christmas carols, and then the generals said, we got to rotate the people out of there because they're getting too familiar with the enemy. So they can't connect. But allowed to connect, we could avoid it. If we could only put aside those differences and realize that we're we are more alike than we think. And ultimately, coming back to what we started with, we are the one, So I have hope for this evolutionary leap of consciousness.
Bruce, this has been a great conversation. I look forward to many more with you. You're a visionary. You're a fabulous teacher. And I look forward to being a guest lecturer in your course in personal paranormal history.
It's going to be wonderful, Jeffrey. And I love listening to your broadcasts. And you've been doing this a very long time. And you got that well-deserved reward or award. And you just keep doing what you're doing, forever. That's what I want to. I want to see that happen, because you mean so much to so many people.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time today to be with me and the New Thinking Aloud audience. And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us, because you are the reason that we are here.
Book 3 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue 7 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine, or order a beautiful printed copy.